I sat there in silence as my daughter laughed and said, "What do you need money for? You're about to die anyway." The whole room burst into laughter, thinking I was just a foolish old woman. But then I opened the chest in the basement and their faces turned pale. If you think this is just another family drama, you're dead wrong. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next shocking episodes we bring you. It was a rainy Friday afternoon in Vermont, the kind of gray that swallowed sound and slowed time. The Hale house stood at the end of a winding gravel path hidden behind a veil of overgrown lilacs and towering oak trees. It was a house with history, with creaky floorboards and drafty windows, and a fireplace that still smelled of the same birch logs Margaret Hale had stacked decades ago with her late husband. Margaret stood in this kitchen, her spine slightly curved, but her movements steady, precise. At 74, she no longer rushed for anyone, not even for the ghosts of her memories that lingered in every corner of the house. The kettle hissed faintly on the stove. She pulled down her best porcelain teacup's ivory with blue cornflower rims and placed them on a silver tray that once belonged to her grandmother. Rain pattered against the kitchen windows. The scent of chamomile filled the air. Margaret's hands moved over a stack of old photo frames on the counter. One by one, she dusted them with a soft cloth. Brandon's high school graduation, Sylvia's dance recital, Henry holding a model airplane. They stared back at her like strangers now smiling young and unburdened by the years that had turned love into ledger sheets. A knock at the door cut through the silence. She didn't move right away. She stared at the last photo, one of Ellie as a child sitting cross-legged in a pile of sawdust beside Margaret's workbench, holding a tiny wooden birdhouse painted pale yellow. Another knock, sharper this time. Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the door, unfastening the chain lock. When she opened it, a gust of wind carried in the smell of wet pine and road salt. Brandon entered first. 49 tall and dressed in a tailored raincoat that screamed Manhattan finance. He didn't kiss her cheek or even offer a greeting, just a curt nod and a glance at his watch. Traffic was hell, he muttered. Behind him, Sylvia swept in like a storm of perfume and patent leather. Her umbrella snapped shut with practiced precision, sending droplets across the floor. "You really ought to get that front step fixed, Mother. Someone could sue." And then came Henry, dragging a half-smile behind him like a wet coat. He wore a beanie, ironic glasses, and a hoodie that looked like it hadn't seen detergent in weeks. Margaret offered no protest, no welcome. She simply gestured toward the parlor. The parlor hadn't changed since the Reagan administration. The wallpaper peeled slightly in the corners. The chandelier dimmed with age. The sofa was threadbare, the armchairs mismatched, but everything was clean and in place like a shrine no one had visited in years. They settled awkwardly, Brandon on the arm of the couch, Sylvia crossing her legs with exaggerated grace, and Henry thumbing his phone until Margaret cleared her throat. "I made tea." "We'll survive," Sylvia said, not looking up. Margaret poured herself a cup anyway and sat in her rocking chair by the fireplace. She reached for the envelope on the side table, the one they assumed contained bank accounts, wills, deeds, or something equally transactional. They were wrong. So Brandon began clasping his hands. "Let's get down to business." Sylvia glanced at him with amusement. "Mom, you said this was about your estate, right?" Henry didn't speak. He rarely did. But the tapping of his fingers on the screen was loud enough. Margaret sipped her tea. The tension in the room hung like a fraying rope. "Let me ask you something first," she said quietly. "When was the last time any of you visited without a reason tied to money?" Brandon looked at the ceiling. Sylvia laughed, sharp, cruel, the kind that cuts you twice. "Oh, don't start with the guilt trips. We all have lives, you know, careers, families, responsibilities." "You mean your dogs and your wine clubs," Margaret replied. Sylvia's smile disappeared. "Excuse me, I said what I meant." Brandon sat forward. "Mom, let's just get to the point. We came because you said it was urgent." "I did." Margaret placed the envelope back on the table. "But not for the reasons you think." Sylvia rolled her eyes. "This is about that ridiculous furniture workshop you keep in the barn, isn't it? Or maybe your journals, those little notebooks full of rants and wood shavings?" Henry finally spoke, voice flat. You know she keeps everything right, even that busted lathe. I bet she thinks it's some priceless antique. Margaret's eyes narrowed. That busted lathe was the first tool I ever owned. Your father gave it to me on our 2nd anniversary. I made your cribs with it. A beat of silence. Brandon cleared his throat. Look, none of us want to fight. We just want to make sure you're protected. You're not getting younger, Mom. Sylvia folded her arms. Exactly. And that means it's time to start talking seriously about the estate. We need to know what we're dealing with so we can plan accordingly. Plan what Margaret asked. Well, Sylvia continued, Brandon's been looking at expanding his business. Henry might finally want to go back to school. I've been exploring some art therapy programs in Oregon. Henry scoffed under his breath. Margaret leaned back in her chair. The tea had gone cold in her hands. She looked out the window for a moment. Rain ran down the glass like tears that had no urgency to fall. Then she stood. I'm not dying tomorrow. Sylvia shrugged. You don't know that. Come on, Mom, don't be dramatic. Margaret turned slowly. Do you think I'm some withered husk waiting to hand you a check? Brandon raised his hands. Nobody said that. Sylvia smirked. You're 74, Mom. Let's not pretend you've got decades ahead. It was the way she said it, like Margaret was already irrelevant, like her breath was borrowed and her memories expendable. Margaret's gaze turned to Henry. Do you feel the same? Henry didn't answer. Sylvia uncrossed her legs, stood up, and walked over to the fireplace. Her manicured fingers traced the edge of a wooden sculpture, a maple carving of a bird in flight. Honestly, she said, I think it's time you cleaned house, sold this place, got yourself somewhere easier, a condo maybe, with a lift. Margaret crossed the room, took the carving from Sylvia's hand and placed it back in its spot. She looked her daughter in the eye and spoke with measured grace. You think all of this is clutter, useless things, trash, but everything in this house has a story. Then write a book, Sylvia snapped, because no one wants to inherit your stories. Margaret didn't blink. Maybe you're right. Henry looked up. Wait, really? Brandon sat up straighter. I'm not giving you any of it, she said. At least not yet. A beat, then another. What the hell does that mean? Brandon asked, voice rising. Margaret walked to the mantel, picked up a photo of Ellie, the only person whose face still made her heart soften. It means, she said carefully, that this weekend you're going to help me clean the basement. Sylvia recoiled. What, that dust box? Why? Margaret smiled just a little. Because if you're so interested in what I'll leave behind, you should at least see where it comes from. Henry frowned. You're kidding. I'm not. Brandon stood. You dragged us out here for a basement cleanup. Margaret met his glare without flinching. No. I invited you here to see what matters. If you still can't recognize it, then perhaps you're not entitled to it. Sylvia looked around in disbelief. This is insane. Margaret turned toward the hallway, her voice as cold and steady as the rain outside. Saturday morning, 8 sharp. Wear something you don't mind getting dirty. She walked out of the room, leaving them behind 3 grown children who came seeking assets, but found something far more dangerous, a mother who had nothing left to prove and everything left to reveal. Under the dim light of the parlor's aging chandelier, the silence that followed Margaret's announcement was thick with unspoken thoughts and poorly concealed offense. Her children exchanged glances, reading each other with the instinct of those who had schemed together before. Did you see her hands? Sylvia whispered once they were alone in the upstairs guest room door, barely closed. She trembled when she picked up that photo. She's not in her right mind. Brandon leaned against the dresser arms, crossed eyes narrowed. She's not senile, she's strategic. This isn't about nostalgia, it's a distraction. Henry lounged on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, scrolling. You really think she's hiding something down there? I think, Brandon said slowly, that people don't suddenly get sentimental about cleaning basements unless they're guarding something. Documents, jewelry, maybe even cash. Gold, Sylvia asked, raising an eyebrow. Brandon shrugged. Could be. You remember when Dad died, there were rumors about unreported royalties from that antique chair design he sold in '78. That was a myth. Was it? Brandon's voice sharpened. Or was it just something none of us bothered to check because we assumed Mom had already spent it all on rocking chairs and bird feed? Henry finally looked up. If she has money, I want my cut. Sylvia folded her arms. We all do. And if she thinks she can pass it to someone else like that weird church charity she's always supporting, we'll have to get legal. Careful, Brandon warned. If we push too hard, she'll clam up. "So we play along?" Henry asked. "For now," Brandon said. "We clean the damn basement. We smile. We act interested. And then we find what we need." Downstairs, the fire in the hearth had dwindled to embers. Margaret stood by the back window, hands clasped, watching the garden fade into mist. A crow called in the distance, as if punctuating the silence she now bathed in. Outside, the rain had softened into a misty drizzle. The air smelled like wet wood and earth. Beyond the creaky porch in the sheltered backyard, Ellie knelt on the flagstone patio, one hand steadying the leg of an old wooden chair, the other gripping a chisel. Tap, pause, tap. The girl worked in rhythm, her focus unshakable, her mouth a thin, determined line. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, and sawdust clung to her jeans like gold flecks. Next to her sat a toolbox, its compartments worn and familiar, some with little pieces of masking tape labeled in Margaret's neat handwriting hinges, brass nails, wood glue. Margaret pushed the screen door open slowly. It creaked like everything else in the house, a sound that somehow always reminded her of opening and closing chapters in a long book. Ellie looked up but didn't smile. She rarely did while working. It was something Margaret both admired and understood. "How's the leg?" Margaret asked, easing herself down on the bench nearby. Ellie tested it, placing pressure gently on the joint. "Better. The dowel joint was split. I replaced it and reinforced the base. Should hold now." "You always had good hands," Margaret murmured. "Even at 6, you knew the difference between pine and oak by scent." Ellie didn't respond, but her eyes softened. "You remember the birdhouse?" Margaret asked, a small smile touching her lips. "The yellow one," Ellie replied, "with the mismatched shingles. You insisted they were dragon scales." Ellie's cheeks flushed faintly. Margaret leaned back against the bench, pulling her cardigan tighter. "The others think I'm losing it. They've always thought that." Margaret chuckled low and warm. "Yes, but now they believe it matters." Ellie set the chisel aside and looked up. "Why are they really here? They think I'm dying." "Are you?" Margaret turned her gaze to the garden. "Not yet. Not in the way they hope." A moment passed between them, thick with unspoken truths and fragile comfort. "Saturday morning," Margaret said. "I want you there, in the basement." Ellie nodded. "Okay. There's something I want them to see. But more importantly, something I want you to understand." Ellie waited. Margaret's voice dropped barely above the breeze. "You've always wondered why I never left this place. Why I kept working in a shop that leaks when it rains with tools that belonged to my great-grandfather. Why I never remarried, never sold the business, never packed up and followed your parents to the city." Ellie nodded. "It's not because I'm stubborn," Margaret continued, "though I am. It's because there's something here, something worth preserving, and not the kind of worth your father and aunt are thinking about." "Then what kind of worth?" Ellie asked, wiping her hands. "The kind that doesn't come with a dollar sign. Legacy, identity, truth." The wind picked up, fluttering the hem of Margaret's cardigan. She looked down at the chisel Ellie had placed beside her. "I built my first chair with that chisel," she said softly. 1971. Your grandfather and I couldn't afford a crib, so I carved one. The legs were uneven and the joints were rough, but it didn't collapse. That's how Hale and Comey began. Not in a studio, not in a factory. Right there in the middle of a one-bedroom rental with sawdust in the soup and paint on the floor. Ellie's eyes widened. "You started Hale & Co., she whispered. Margaret nodded. "Your grandfather handled the front end, the branding, the partnerships. But the designs, the craftsmanship, that was mine, until he died and the rest unraveled." "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" Margaret looked her in the eye. "Because nobody asked. Not until now." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded cloth. Inside it was a worn photograph, black and white, creased from time. 2 young adults' arms speckled with sawdust beaming beside a stack of furniture pieces. "That's the first collection," Margaret said. "We sold every piece at a flea market in New Hampshire, made enough money to buy a real table saw." Ellie held the photo like it was something sacred. Her hands trembled. "This weekend," Margaret said, voice steady, "they'll dig through the past looking for proof of wealth. But you, Ellie, you'll find something more important." "What?" Margaret smiled faintly. "The reason I never let go." Rain began again, soft and steady. Ellie looked down at the photo, then at the chair she was restoring, then back to her grandmother. "I'll be there," she said. Margaret nodded, rising slowly. "And when the time comes, you'll know what to do." She turned and walked back toward the house, her figure silhouetted against the gray sky, shrinking into the mist, like a memory moving forward rather than fading away. Ellie sat in silence, the photo in her lap, the weight of history pressing gently on her shoulders. She didn't know exactly what lay in the basement or what her family would try to take, but for the first time she felt it. This wasn't about furniture. This was about truth buried deep in wood grain and silence waiting to be found. The morning was thick with dew, and the sun hadn't quite broken through the low Vermont clouds when the Hale family gathered again, this time dressed in jeans, flannel shirts, and uneasy silence. Margaret stood by the narrow basement door, her hair tucked neatly in a bun, her eyes sharper than any of them remembered. She held a small lantern in one hand, the other rested on the doorknob, steady and calm. "Ready?" she asked. Brandon nodded curtly, trying to disguise his impatience behind a forced smirk. Sylvia examined her boots clearly, regretting not wearing something more rugged. Henry was the last to respond, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, like the idea of physical effort hadn't fully registered. Margaret opened the door. The smell hit first aged wood mildew and the metallic tang of time. A thin bulb at the top of the stairs flickered overhead. The steps groaned under their weight as they descended one by one into a space forgotten by light. The basement was exactly what they'd expected, and yet entirely different. Cobwebs hung from the low ceiling. Dust floated like dandelion seeds in the air, disturbed by the rare intrusion of movement. Old shelves lined the walls, cluttered with mason jars, toolboxes, folded tarps, and antique trunks. In one corner stood a long-forgotten workbench layered in sawdust and memory. Margaret moved with eerie familiarity, navigating the maze of objects like a conductor among instruments long out of tune. "What exactly are we looking for?" Brandon asked, already annoyed. "You'll know it when you see it," Margaret replied, setting the lantern on a crate. Sylvia pulled a scarf over her nose. "This place is a museum for junk. You should have burned it down and started over." Margaret didn't answer. She simply moved toward the back wall where the foundation stones met in a curve. Ellie followed behind, instinctively aware that this wasn't just clutter, it was curation. Each pile, each item had been placed with purpose. It was Henry of all people who saw it first. "Over here," he said, pointing to a squat rusted chest, half buried beneath an old tarp and a stack of wooden crates. Brandon stepped forward and brushed off the dust. The chest was iron dark pitted and bolted, with an antique lock shaped like a curled fern. A small nameplate dulled with age was nailed into the top. M.L. Hale, private. "Well," Sylvia said with a scoff that's not ominous at all. Brandon knelt and tugged at the latch. It didn't budge. "It's locked," he muttered, jiggling it harder. "Figures." Sylvia glanced around. "Do you have the key?" Margaret stepped forward, calm as ever. She reached beneath her blouse and pulled out the long silver chain she always wore, the one they had all assumed held nothing more than sentiment. At the end of it dangled a small brass key, ornately cut, glinting faintly in the dust-speckled light. She inserted it into the lock. It turned with a quiet click. The sound echoed through the basement like a gunshot. Slowly she lifted the lid. Inside was no treasure chest of gold or forgotten cash. There were no bearer bonds or hidden diamonds. Just paper, folders, notebooks, photographs, rolled up architectural plans tied with fraying ribbons. Dozens of them. Brandon furrowed his brow. "What the hell is all this?" Sylvia pulled out a bundle of yellowing pages. Furniture sketches. Ellie moved forward carefully, retrieving a blueprint from the side. She unrolled it on the workbench with reverence, her fingers tracing the detailed drawing of a handcrafted rocking chair, every joint, curve, and grain line annotated in delicate cursive. Margaret watched their reactions silently. Henry picked up a manila folder and flipped it open. Inside were legal documents, copyright registrations, patent filings, and a stamped certificate bearing the name Hale & Co. His voice cracked. "Wait, Hale & Co." He turned to his siblings. "You don't think—" Sylvia blinked. "That can't be." Henry read aloud, "Original design rights filed 1974. M.L. Hale. Secondary partner George W. Hale." Brandon stepped back, stunned. "That's not possible. That's the company Dad helped launch back in the day. It got bought out in the 80s, rebranded, and now it's everywhere. They're selling reproductions in European galleries. Margaret spoke for the first time since opening the chest. Not reproductions. Originals, based on my work, my hands, my ideas. Sylvia turned slowly. You're telling me you founded Hale & Co.? I co-founded it, Margaret corrected. But I designed every chair, table, and cabinet that left our workshop for the first 6 years. Brandon ran his fingers through his hair. Why didn't we know any of this? Because you never asked, Margaret said. And because when your father died, the investors forced me out. Said I wasn't fit to lead. That women don't belong in the business of furniture, only in the aesthetics of it. I had no power, no leverage. So I left. And I took everything they hadn't claimed. Ellie lifted another design. It was a writing desk, elegant with dovetail joints and hand-carved legs shaped like tree branches. I've seen this desk, she whispered, in a gallery catalog. It was selling for $30,000. Margaret nodded. They kept the style, but not the soul. Sylvia clutched one of the copyright papers. You still own this? Everything in that chest. Every design, every sketch, every patent they let expire. It's mine. And now, it's yours. The room fell quiet. Dust danced in the light from the lantern like tiny ghosts of ambition once buried but not forgotten. Brandon shook his head. You've been sitting on this for decades. Why now? Margaret's voice was soft but unyielding. Because now you care. Not about me, but about what I might leave behind. I wanted to see if any of you would come down here for me or only for what you thought I was hiding. Sylvia looked around the basement, her eyes landing on the scattered relics of a life she'd never cared to explore. You really did all this alone? She asked. Margaret nodded. Alone, yes, but not in silence. Every plank of wood, every nail, every stain and finish. It all has a voice. You just never listened. Never? Henry took a slow breath. And Ellie. Margaret turned to her granddaughter. She listened. Ellie's hands trembled as she gathered a handful of sketches, cradling them like artifacts. I thought you were just teaching me a hobby. I was teaching you everything I had left to give. In that moment, the basement didn't feel dark or dusty. It felt sacred. Not because of the paper, because of the truth it held. Margaret turned to the others. You still have a choice. Help preserve what matters or watch it be passed on to those who will. Brandon looked down at his shoes. Sylvia stepped back from the workbench. Henry said nothing. Only Ellie moved forward. Only Ellie saw the chest not as a box of secrets, but as an invitation. And for Margaret that was enough. The room had quieted, but not with peace. It was the kind of silence that brims with pressure like a dam seconds from rupture. Brandon stood stiff near the workbench, arms folded tight across his chest. Henry hovered nearby, eyes darting between his mother and the scattered documents, like a man who had just realized he was on the losing side of a deal. Sylvia, however, was the first to break. So let me get this straight, she snapped, holding one of the yellowed patent documents between two trembling fingers. You helped build Hale & Coney, got forced out, and then, what? Sat on all of this for 40 years. Margaret didn't flinch. She stepped away from the open chest, her shadow stretching long across the basement floor. I didn't sit on it, she said evenly. I protected it. Sylvia's laugh was sharp and humorless. Protected it from what your own children... No, Margaret said, and for the first time her voice dropped a note. From the same entitlement that nearly destroyed it the first time. That stopped Sylvia short. Margaret turned to the lantern, adjusting its position slightly, so the light hit the plans laid out across the workbench. The soft orange glow illuminated details, handwritten measurements, annotations in fountain pen, small smudges of ink where her hand must have hesitated decades ago. I started Hale & Coney in 1971, she said. Your father and I had barely enough savings for lumber and nails, let alone tools. We rented space in the back of an abandoned grain barn, built every piece by hand, and sold our first line from the back of a pickup truck. Henry raised an eyebrow. Why have we never heard this? Because you never asked, Margaret answered without turning. She picked up one of the blueprints, the same elegant desk Ellie had admired, and smoothed it with her hands, tracing its shape like she was remembering a melody. In 1978, we were offered a buyout by a larger design firm. Your father wanted to accept. He saw the money, the safety net, the college funds, the retirement years we hadn't earned yet. I saw a risk. I didn't want to give up control of our designs. Brandon's voice cut in clipped and sharp. But he sold anyway. Margaret nodded. He did. And they wanted him to stay on as the face. Not me. I was offered a silent stake, a name on paper, no votes, no voice. Her gaze turned back to the chest. So I walked away. Took what I had, the original concepts, the unused models, the copyrights they hadn't filed, and I buried them in my name. Sylvia stepped forward, eyes blazing. And let the brand grow without you. Margaret shrugged. I built something of my own. Quietly. Custom commissions, private collectors. Some under my initials, some under no name at all. But you could have claimed it. The legacy, the money, Sylvia hissed. We could have inherited it. That's when Margaret turned. Slow, intentional, and deadly calm. You mean you would have inherited it? You who once told me woodworking was a peasant's trade. You who sneered when I wore sawdust on my sleeves instead of pearls. What would you have done with it, Sylvia? Turned it into a boutique candle line. Brandon raised his hands. Let's not turn this into an emotional ambush. If you had a stake in Hale & Co., if these designs are still viable, then we, your children, have a right to a portion of that value, legally. Ellie, who had remained silent, seated beside the workbench with her knees tucked beneath her, lifted her head at that. Margaret saw her eyes wide red at the corners, hands trembling slightly as she held a sketch of a bookshelf shaped like a tree. She softened. There is no legal battle here, Margaret said. These assets, this intellectual property, were never tied to the company after I left. They belong solely to me. I kept the registrations renewed, paid the taxes on the copyrights. I did it all out of pocket. Not once did I ask any of you for help. Henry scoffed. Because you didn't tell us anything existed. Margaret's tone turned cold. And tell me, Henry, what have you ever created that wasn't borrowed or bought with someone else's effort? Henry's face flushed and he looked away. Sylvia stepped toward Ellie, her heels cracking faintly against the cement floor. And her, she asked, motioning toward the girl. She's what your successor now, the next great Hale. Ellie's mouth opened, but Margaret raised a hand before she could speak. Yes, Margaret said, if she wants it. Sylvia's mouth dropped open. You cannot be serious. Deadly. Brandon ran a hand down his face, pacing a slow circle around the basement. You know what this sounds like. Manipulation. You lured us here, dangled a mystery, and now you've revealed some elaborate scheme where the granddaughter gets everything and the children are left with dust. Margaret took a long breath. I asked you to come here to see who you've become. We're your family, Henry said bitterly. No, Margaret said, voice sharp now, like a chisel against stubborn grain. You're strangers who happen to share my blood. You didn't come here for me. You came for what you thought you were owed. Sylvia stepped forward. So, what you're going to write us out of everything? That's your grand finale. Give it all to a 20-something woodshop dropout who still lives in her parents' garage. Ellie's face stiffened, but Margaret stepped in between them. I'm giving it to the one person who showed up without an agenda, the one who didn't laugh at my calloused hands, who sat with me in the shed through winters with no heat just to learn how to sand a joint properly. Ellie knows the stories behind these designs. She knows why they matter. Sylvia crossed her arms. We can contest this. Margaret tilted her head. You can. And lose. I have lawyers. Paper trails, and if it comes to that, I will go public. I'll let the world know that the 3 children of Margaret Hale tried to tear down the very thing their mother spent her life building. Brandon's jaw clenched. Henry exhaled through his nose, slow and measured. Sylvia stared at her mother like she didn't recognize her anymore. You were never this cruel, she said softly. No, Margaret said. But I was always this clear. You just didn't bother to listen. She turned back to Ellie, who was now gathering up the designs, folding them carefully like treasure. I don't need your approval, Margaret said to the room. But I do need to make this right before I leave this world. Sylvia's voice broke. And you think Ellie will honor your legacy better than we could? Margaret looked down at her granddaughter, and for a long moment there was nothing but pride in her eyes. I know she will. The air in the basement turned heavier thick, not with dust now, but with accusation. Tension rolled across the space like a slow-coming storm. Margaret, unfazed, reached into a canvas satchel she had brought down from upstairs. Her fingers worked deliberately unhurried until she pulled out a worn, cream-colored envelope bound with a simple ribbon. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she walked over to the workbench, brushed aside a rolled blueprint, and laid the envelope down as though it were a verdict. "This," she said, "is the original version of my will, drafted 6 years ago. Never filed in probate because I wasn't done writing the ending." Brandon's face tightened. "What does that mean?" Margaret untied the ribbon, slid out the document, and began unfolding the pages with the precision of someone who had done this before more than once. "It means," she said, eyes still down on the parchment, "that I wanted to give myself time. Time to see who you all became. Not the children I raised, but the adults you chose to be." She handed the will to Brandon first. He took it cautiously as if it might burn him. Sylvia stepped closer, practically reaching over his shoulder. Henry looked on from the back, arms crossed but leaning in. Brandon's eyes scanned the page quickly. Then his jaw set. "There's nothing here," he muttered. Margaret corrected him. "There's everything." Brandon read aloud, voice rising with every word. "All physical and intellectual assets, including but not limited to personal belongings, property and proprietary designs, are to remain within my personal control or be passed to a qualified heir of my choosing, based solely on merit, integrity, and emotional connection, not bloodline." He looked up, disbelief blazing. "You wrote us out. All of us." "I didn't write you out," Margaret said, voice calm. "You removed yourselves." Sylvia yanked the pages from his hands. "This is outrageous. You have 3 children, flesh and blood. You don't get to pretend we don't exist just because you're offended by what our tone." Margaret's mouth thinned into a quiet line. She picked up one of her oldest sketches, a hand-drawn design of a table made from reclaimed oak beams, annotated in delicate cursive. Her signature rested at the bottom like a whisper of ownership. "You think this is about tone?" she asked. "No, it's about the years of distance, of dismissal, of watching you all forget who I am outside of your narratives." Brandon slammed a hand down on the workbench, startling Ellie. "So what are we to you now, huh? After all these years? Ghosts or just shadows?" Margaret turned toward him, eyes unblinking. "You are exactly what you made yourselves into. Spectators. Bystanders to a life you had no interest in unless it came wrapped in money or legal clauses." Henry took a slow step forward. "That's not fair, isn't it?" Margaret's voice cracked, not with anger but with exhaustion. "When was the last time any of you asked me why I still built things with my hands? Why I refused to move out of this house? Why I never remarried, never traveled, never spent the money you all assumed I didn't have?" Sylvia shot back. "Because you're stubborn." "No," Margaret said, stepping closer, "because I've lived in the shadow of what you chose to forget. And now you're angry not because I withheld the truth, but because the truth doesn't serve you." Brandon's hands clenched. This isn't legal. We have rights." "Rights," Margaret repeated. "You think blood entitles you to legacy?" Brandon turned to Sylvia. "Get your lawyer, right now." Sylvia was already dialing, her hand trembling only slightly. She walked to the far end of the basement, pacing under the bare bulb that swung slightly from the ceiling like a pendulum counting down. "You're doing this out of spite," Henry said. "You want to punish us." Margaret turned away from him, her eyes settling on Ellie, still kneeling beside the chest, her fingers lightly brushing the edge of a velvet folder. In her posture there was no demand, no expectation, only reverence. "I'm doing this," Margaret said, "because I'm tired of pretending that inheritance is something you earn by surviving me." Sylvia turned back from the phone, voice clipped. "Gina will be here Monday. She says this smells like coercion, that you might not be of sound mind, that you might have been manipulated." Margaret's head tilted. "By whom?" "My tools, the sawdust." Sylvia stepped forward, phone still in hand. "No, by her." Everyone turned to Ellie. Brandon folded his arms. "She's the one spending all this time with you. She's the one who knew about the basement. Don't act like you didn't influence her." Ellie stood slowly. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "I didn't ask for anything." "That's exactly what makes you dangerous," Sylvia snapped. Henry cut in sharper now. "You think this will hold up in court, that a girl who still lives with her mother and has 0 business experience is somehow more qualified than 3 full-grown adults?" "You're not qualified," Margaret said, her voice steel now. "You're entitled. And that's the difference. Brandon's voice dropped to a growl. You want to fight? You've got it. I'm not fighting, Margaret said. I'm documenting. Sylvia's voice rose. You're choosing her over us. Just admit it. Margaret turned to them all, her gaze sweeping across the three faces she had once read bedtime stories to. You chose greed over grace, and now you're shocked there's a cost. Brandon threw his hands in the air. So that's it. We're just erased. No, Margaret said. You erased yourselves. I simply took note. Henry turned away, muttering something under his breath. Sylvia paced in tight, angry circles, snapping off another call. Brandon stood perfectly still, eyes dark as though waiting for the moment she would say it was all a test and that they'd passed. But Margaret said nothing more. Ellie stepped closer to her grandmother, placing a hand on her shoulder. In that quiet touch there was everything the others had forgotten how to give, and everything Margaret had waited so long to receive. The house no longer breathed with quiet nostalgia. After Sylvia's phone call and Brandon's threat of litigation, the atmosphere turned clinical cutthroat. Margaret's basement wasn't a place of memory anymore. It had become a crime scene in their eyes. Every file a potential weapon, every design, every signature a piece of leverage. Ellie sat alone at the kitchen table now, shoulders tense, eyes locked on a half-full mug of tea that had gone cold. Rain drizzled faintly outside, and the ticking of the antique wall clock was the only thing marking time. Margaret stood at the window, her silhouette outlined in muted gray. They're not going to stop, are they? Ellie asked quietly. Margaret didn't turn. No. They've already lost what mattered. Now they want to win something, anything, to make the loss feel smaller. A knock rattled the front door. Brandon entered first, legal pad in hand, wearing the kind of smug restraint that belongs to men who believe paperwork is their sharpest blade. Sylvia followed closely, her hair tied back, phone in one hand, voice recorder in the other. Henry trailed behind, distracted, withdrawn, but watching. We want a statement from Ellie, Sylvia said immediately. About the documents, about your conversations, about whether you've been influenced. Margaret raised an eyebrow. This isn't a courtroom. No, Brandon interjected, but it will be, and we're collecting facts now before it is. Ellie looked at her grandmother, then slowly rose. I'll speak, she said, but not for you. Sylvia's mouth twisted. You'll speak because you have to. No, Ellie said evenly. I'll speak because I remember. She took a deep breath, then looked straight at her mother. You remember the spring 5 years ago, the day you brought me here with those documents in your bag? Sylvia's brow furrowed, but her mouth didn't move. You told Grandma she needed to sign them quickly, Ellie continued. Said it was just a property reassessment, for taxes. Sylvia's voice was cold. I don't recall that. I do, Ellie said. I stood right there. You made her sit down in the den. You rushed her through 3 pages, told her she was being dramatic when she asked to read the fine print. When she hesitated, you raised your voice. Brandon frowned. What are you implying? She didn't know, Ellie whispered. You told her she was just verifying the address, but the forms, her voice cracked. They were sale agreements. She was signing over temporary rights to the east parcel of land. And she didn't know. Sylvia's eyes flared. That's ridiculous. You were barely 20. I was old enough to see her hand shake, Ellie said. Old enough to remember you saying, this house is too much for one person. You'll thank me later. Margaret turned from the window, now gaze locked on her daughter. Is it true? Sylvia hesitated, then scoffed. Oh, come on. It was a technicality. I needed leverage for a short-term investment. It didn't even finalize. Henry's voice entered the room for the first time, low and measured. Actually, it did. All heads turned. What are you talking about? Sylvia asked. Henry pulled out his phone, eyes glued to the screen. After we came down to the basement, I did some digging. Quietly. Wanted to see how real all this was. If there were other filings, other registrations. He paused. There are. What did you find? Margaret asked, stepping forward. Henry exhaled. A legal transfer dated 5 years ago. Temporary property rights for Hale East Holdings, signed by a Margaret L. Hale, witnessed and notarized under Sylvia M. Hale's oversight. The witness signature was faked. Brandon looked stunned. Wait, seriously? Yeah, Henry said. And it gets worse. He scrolled again, then held up his phone to show Margaret a PDF. Last year, Sylvia filed an application to license a derivative brand, H&Co Originals, using scans of your original designs, some of the same ones in the basement chest. She listed herself as the creator. Sylvia went rigid. That's a lie. It's public record, Henry said. I checked the design copyright database. You can see the document's application ID number HCO207 registered through an agency in Albany. It lists the dining set blueprint, the bentwood chair, even the curved shelving unit from 1982. Margaret's face didn't show shock, only disappointment, the kind that is colder than anger. You stole them, she said quietly. The designs, my name. Sylvia's voice sharpened. It wasn't theft. It was preservation. You weren't doing anything with them. I was just repurposing the legacy. That legacy wasn't yours to manipulate, Margaret said. You knew what they meant. You watched me build them with my bare hands, and you turned them into assets for pitch decks and Instagram campaigns. Ellie took a slow step back, her throat tight with rising emotion. Brandon looked to Sylvia, fuming. You didn't tell us any of this. I was going to, she snapped. It wasn't ready yet. Henry shook his head. You were going to sell the history out from under us. That's what you were going to do. Sylvia's face flushed red. Oh, don't act like you care. You wouldn't know a dovetail joint from a desk lamp. This isn't about craft, Margaret cut in. It's about character. She turned to Henry. Forward those documents to me. He nodded silently. Margaret moved to the hutch in the hallway, opened a narrow drawer, and pulled out a small folder. You want a courtroom fine, but you'll walk in knowing I hold the real ownership. Every patent, every filing, every original date-stamped sketch. I kept receipts literally. Sylvia backed up slightly. You don't have to turn this into war. You declared war, Margaret said, when you forged my name. Ellie looked at her mother, eyes full of something ancient betrayal, not just for herself, but for the generations before her. You weren't protecting the brand, Ellie said. You were rewriting it, without its maker, without its meaning. Sylvia turned away toward the door. This isn't over, she said, voice tight. No, Margaret replied. But it's finally being seen for what it is. And in the quiet that followed, nothing needed to be said. The truth had stepped fully into the room, and it wasn't leaving. The storm came later that night, not from the sky, but from the kitchen. It began with silence. Sylvia stood by the window, arms crossed, framed by the soft yellow glow of the overhead pendant light. The rain outside tapped against the glass in nervous rhythms. On the table, a cup of untouched tea sat, growing colder by the minute, its steam long since surrendered. Margaret entered the kitchen quietly barefoot, wearing her thick-knit cardigan and that look she always wore when truth was on the tip of her tongue. Sylvia didn't turn around. So this is how it ends, she said. A daughter turned stranger. A legacy handed to someone who hasn't even lived long enough to understand what sacrifice means. Margaret's voice came firm, even. Sacrifice isn't something you shout about. It's something you live through without needing applause. Sylvia turned eyes sharp. Oh, please save the wisdom. You sat on all that wealth, all those rights, and let us believe we grew up poor. No, Margaret said, stepping forward. I let you believe I wasn't useful to you anymore. Sylvia's mouth opened slightly, a flicker of something, hesitation or guilt passing through her. She moved to the cabinet, yanked it open, pulled down a glass with unnecessary force. Don't twist this, she said. You raised us with secrets. You raised us in silence. Margaret leaned against the kitchen counter. I raised you with more than enough. I gave you work ethic, values, a roof and warmth. I didn't owe you explanations. You owed me curiosity. Sylvia's fingers tightened around the glass. Don't act like I never cared. Margaret smiled sadly. Caring doesn't sound like asking me if I remember how to use a microwave. Caring isn't filing copyright applications in my name behind my back. Caring certainly isn't calling your mother a burden over drinks with your brothers while you thought I was asleep. Sylvia stiffened. You were eavesdropping. I was in the next room. Margaret said, her voice suddenly rough. And you weren't whispering. You said. She paused, letting the words hang like blades. What's the point of leaving anything to a woman who barely knows what year it is anymore? Sylvia's lips parted. The color drained slightly from her face. That was, she began, but her voice faltered. That was years ago. A joke. No, Margaret said softly. It was a revelation. Sylvia slammed the glass down on the counter. So what I said some stupid things. We all have. That doesn't mean I don't deserve anything. I'm your daughter, for God's sake. Margaret stepped closer. Being my daughter means you get a place in my heart, not a claim on what I've built. Sylvia's voice dropped low, bitter. You just want to feel superior, sitting on your little empire of dust and sawdust, acting like a martyr. You want to punish us for growing up. No, Margaret said. I want to honor the parts of me you chose to ignore. Sylvia laughed once sharp. This is all because of Ellie, isn't it? You think she's some prodigy? She doesn't even know what real life is yet. She's still playing with tools like it's a school project. Margaret's eyes lit with something fierce. She listens. She respects. She doesn't ask what she'll get. She asks what she can make. Sylvia snorted. Right. So she's perfect now. I bet you even recorded some of our conversations, didn't you? For insurance. Margaret tilted her head. I didn't need to, but Henry did. Sylvia's breath caught. Margaret moved to the old bread box on the counter, pulled out a small black flash drive, set it down with deliberate calm. Henry sent this to me last night, she said. He found it in his old hard drive while going through files from college. Apparently you borrowed his recorder once. For a family legacy project, remember? But you never wiped it clean. Sylvia stared at it, frozen. Would you like to know what's on it? Margaret asked gently. Sylvia's voice came quiet. No. Margaret stepped back. Then let me remind you. She folded her arms, eyes unflinching. You said I was a lonely old woman wasting space. You said it wouldn't be long before my mind gave out. You joked that when I passed you'd paint this kitchen white and turn the workshop into a wine bar. Sylvia's throat worked, but no sound came. Margaret's voice softened, but it lost none of its edge. You said all that while I was making you tea, while I was still hanging up Christmas lights with my own hands. You said it because you thought my silence meant permission. Sylvia's chin trembled. I didn't know, she whispered. I didn't think you'd ever. Margaret nodded. I know. Sylvia looked down at the floor. I didn't mean it. Margaret walked to the table and sat slowly, her bones stiff, but her spirit steady. But you said it, and words, Sylvia, leave fingerprints. The two women sat in silence for a long minute. Sylvia's voice broke again. You never gave me the space to be vulnerable. You were always strong, always stubborn. It made us feel unnecessary. I'm sorry if my strength intimidated you, Margaret replied. But that's not a flaw. That's survival. Sylvia collapsed into the chair opposite, her eyes wet now. Why her mom? Why not us? Why didn't you give us a chance? Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked toward the doorway where light spilled in from the hall. Because she never asked for it, she said. And because she never needed me to be weak in order to feel strong. Sylvia wiped at her eyes, frustrated with herself. I just wanted to feel chosen. Margaret reached across the table, took her daughter's hand, and held it not with forgiveness but with acknowledgement. Then maybe you should have acted like someone worth choosing. Sylvia flinched. Margaret stood again, slow and sure, retrieving the flash drive. She walked toward the hallway, paused just before leaving, and turned back one last time. Thank you, she said. Sylvia looked up, confused. For what? Margaret's eyes shone not with tears but with finality. For confirming, she said, who truly deserves what I've built. And then she was gone, leaving Sylvia alone in the kitchen, surrounded by memories that could no longer be weaponized, only regretted. The conference room at Whitmore and Levine smelled like old books and polished ambition. Its high windows let in a gray, listless light, and the mahogany table stretched like a battlefield, each person seated at it clinging to some shred of dignity or delusion. Margaret sat at the head-spine-straight cane, resting beside her chair, calm as stone. On her right was Ellie, quiet hands folded in her lap. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, just the same corduroy jacket with sawdust stains on the sleeves. Her silence wasn't fear. It was focus. Brandon, Sylvia, and Henry filled the other side of the table. Their postures varied, Brandon stiff, Sylvia twitching at her phone every few seconds, Henry chewing on a fingernail he didn't seem to realize was bleeding. They weren't prepared to be summoned here. They thought they were calling the shots. They didn't realize the game had ended days ago. Across from them sat a man in a navy suit, Mr. Lowell, Margaret's attorney of 30 years. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and opened a thick folder with the precision of a surgeon about to cut. I appreciate everyone's presence. He began, voice as polished as the brass corners of his briefcase. Mrs. Margaret L. Hale has requested I review the contents of her updated estate documentation. This supersedes all previous wills and codicils. Sylvia sat forward. Wait, what do you mean supersedes? It means Ms. Hale. Mr. Lowell replied that any former legal arrangements have been revoked and replaced. The current document was finalized, signed, and notarized with 2 legal witnesses 1 week ago. Brandon blinked. That's recent. Yes, Margaret said. Truth tends to rush the pen. Mr. Lowell nodded once and continued. Under Clause 1, the entirety of the Hale estate, including but not limited to physical properties, intellectual property, brand equity, private accounts, royalties, and shares related to Hale & Co., and Hale Revival, is to be inherited in full by Eleanor Jane Hale, granddaughter of the decedent. The words landed like a dropped gavel. Sylvia leaned forward, blinking. Wait, I'm sorry, did you say everything? All of it, Mr. Lowell confirmed. There are no shared inheritances, no divisions. Henry let out a sharp laugh. You can't be serious. Brandon's voice rose. We're her children, her direct bloodline. She can't just... She can, Lowell interrupted. And she did. A silence so pure followed that it felt unnatural. Ellie didn't speak. She stared at her folded hands, her lips pressed together like they might betray her resolve if she gave them air. Mr. Lowell flipped another page. Clause 2 outlines justification. Due to repeated patterns of deception, manipulation, and financial misconduct, the individuals Brandon Hale, Sylvia Hale, and Henry Hale shall receive no portion of the estate. These decisions are final, irrevocable, and protected by a no-contest clause, which, if violated, will automatically transfer all contested shares to 3 named charitable foundations. Brandon stood up, knocking over his chair. She's senile. She's been manipulated. Sylvia paled. Henry went quiet. Margaret's voice rang out clear. I'm not senile. I'm finally sane. Mr. Lowell cleared his throat. And lastly, Clause 3. Should any of the disinherited parties attempt to interfere with the execution of this will legally, financially, or reputationally, their prior engagements and contracts with any businesses tied to Hale or its partners will be reviewed and exposed, including undocumented financial dependencies. Brandon went completely still. What does that mean? He asked slowly. Lowell looked at him over the rim of his glasses. It means if you so much as file a challenge, we will disclose your private line of credit taken against your failing startup using fictitious Hale equity as collateral. An offense that may be of interest to your investors and federal auditors. Sylvia clutched her bag. You're bluffing. Lowell turned to the next sheet and slid it forward. Would you like a printed copy of your forged licensing agreement with the Paris design firm? Or the recorded call from your former client, withdrawing the contract after discovering misrepresentation of ownership? Sylvia's lips moved, but no words came out. Margaret turned to Henry. And you? Henry didn't look up. Lowell supplied the answer anyway. Mr. Henry Hale, currently in default on a $340,000 loan for a co-op development that never materialized. The lender has been notified of the will's terms. They'll know by morning that no Hale trust exists to cover the loss. Henry exhaled slowly. I never thought you'd follow through, he whispered. Margaret tilted her head. That was your first mistake, assuming I was bluffing. Brandon finally lowered himself into the upright chair. His face, once sharp with confidence, was now slack with realization. I used Hale & Co. in our Series B investor pitch, he said quietly. Projected family legacy, heritage, manufacturing continuity. Margaret didn't reply. He wasn't talking to her anymore. He was speaking to the ghost of a plan that had just crumbled to ash. Sylvia stood abruptly. You destroyed us. Do you understand that? Do you even care? Margaret reached for Ellie's hand. No, she said. You destroyed yourselves. I simply stopped protecting you from the consequences. Henry looked up at her, defeated. Why didn't you just warn us? Because you wouldn't have listened, Margaret replied. Warnings don't work on people who think they're immune to gravity. Mr. Lowell closed the folder, locking the latches. We're finished here, unless you wish to initiate litigation, in which case my team will be more than ready. No one spoke. Brandon's eyes were vacant. Sylvia pressed her forehead to her palm. Henry leaned back, staring at the ceiling as though it might offer him answers. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, but inside the wreckage was just beginning. Ellie stood with Margaret, and for the first time in her life she felt the full weight of something her family had never truly understood. Legacy isn't something you take, it's something you earn. The first snowfall of the season had just melted off the rooftops in downtown Montpelier when the double glass doors of Hale Revival swung open to the public for the first time. The space, a once abandoned hardware warehouse restored brick by brick, had been transformed into something alive, a place where light kissed the wood and the past found its breath again. The scent of cedar and linseed oil filled the air, mingling with fresh brewed coffee from the little corner cafe built into the entryway. A hand-carved sign hung above the entrance: Hale Revival Furniture, Heritage, Community. Ellie stood in the center of it all, her hands still stained with finish, her heart pounding louder than the background jazz floating from the speakers. She wore a navy work apron with the Hale crest stitched on the chest, and for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like an apprentice or an inheritor. She felt like the beginning of something. The showroom itself was a living museum of craftsmanship. A mix of original Margaret Hale designs and modern interpretations lined the walls and display floors, rocking chairs with joint signatures carved underneath dovetailed chests, etched with initials, and dining tables, built with reclaimed barnwood, sealed in a satin sheen. Every piece bore a placard with two names, M.L. Hale and E.J. Hale, E.J. To the left, the heart of the space, the communal workshop. Long benches, open tool cabinets, wood shavings scattered like confetti, and laughter, real laughter, coming from the corner where four elderly artisans leaned over a lathe, showing two teenagers how to center a spindle. Margaret sat among them. Her posture was slower now, movements more deliberate, but her eyes had lost none of their clarity. She wore her old denim work shirt sleeves rolled up to her elbows and a bandana tied neatly around her silver hair. Her cane rested beside her, forgotten. A boy of maybe 16 held up a carving knife. "Is this sharp enough, ma'am?" Margaret tested the blade on a pine shaving. "Not for walnut." "Come here, I'll show you." A local reporter from the Vermont Artisan Gazette approached Ellie near the front desk, holding a notepad and microphone. Her press badge swayed gently from her neck as she admired the dovetail joints on a nearby cabinet. "This is extraordinary," the reporter said. "You're what, 25? 26 last week," Ellie said. "And you built this entire brand on your grandmother's legacy." Ellie smiled. "No, I built it beside her." She led the reporter to a long work table by the window, sunbeams spilling across a half-finished cradle. Ellie ran her fingers over the arc of the headboard as if smoothing air itself. "My grandmother always told me," she said, "wood doesn't lie. It holds every scratch, every dent, every repair. It remembers what's done to it, just like families." The reporter scribbled quickly, eyes wide. "That's beautiful. So Hale Revival is more than just furniture." Ellie nodded. "It's a living archive. We teach, we mentor. Every piece we sell funds a community workshop. Every week seniors come here to teach their craft. Every summer teens build their first bench. It's not just revival, it's recovery." In the background, Margaret stood helping a woman shape the edge of a cabinet door. Her laughter rolled across the floor like music. A line of townspeople had formed by the coffee stand, former students of Margaret's old clients' neighbors, who'd heard whispers about the woman who made heirlooms by hand and thunder by silence. A gray-haired man in a checkered coat tapped Ellie on the shoulder. "You the one who made that armoire near the back?" Ellie nodded. "With my grandmother, yes. My wife cried when she saw it," he said. "Said it reminded her of the one her father built in '58. He extended a calloused hand. Thank you for bringing this back. This town needed it." Ellie shook his hand. "So did I." Near the window, a small girl sat sketching designs with a set of colored pencils, while her grandfather sharpened a chisel beside her. They said nothing to each other, but in their silence was the quiet bond of shared creation. At noon, a small bell chimed and the crowd hushed. Margaret moved to the front, one hand on Ellie's arm. Ellie helped her up to the small platform they'd fashioned from reclaimed church pews. Margaret looked out over the gathered faces, old, young, some wide-eyed, others misty. "I've made a lot of things in my life," she began, voice steadier than anyone expected. "Beds, chairs, cabinets, rocking horses. But this place, this right here, is the first thing I've ever made that I didn't think I'd live to see." There was a soft ripple of applause. "I spent years thinking legacy was something you gave, but I've learned it's something that has to be carried. Not by blood, not by birthright, but by hands willing to bear the weight." She looked to Ellie, "And she's got the strongest hands I've ever known." Ellie stepped beside her, eyes glassy, voice strong. "People ask me what it's like to inherit a name like Hale. I tell them the truth. It's not about the name. It's about the work, the honesty of it. My grandmother taught me that the grain in the wood doesn't care who you are, only how you treat it, just like people." The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was thunderous. Margaret stepped down slowly, but with pride rippling in every step. Ellie guided her to a chair beside the central table, and the room flooded with movement again. Reporters typed furiously. Locals placed their first orders. Children watched master carvers in awe. That afternoon, as the sun dipped low and turned the floors golden, Ellie returned to the workbench and picked up a half-carved spindle. She felt her grandmother's gaze on her, steady, quiet, always watching. But this time it didn't feel like expectation. It felt like passing the baton. Outside, a new sign was being hung on the exterior wall. The Hale crest. Below it, the words in simple carved lettering, crafted with memory, built for tomorrow. And inside, Ellie smiled, because she knew the real work had only just begun. The ribbon had long since been cut. The applause faded into the grain of the floorboards, but the crowd at Hale Revival remained thick with warmth. Strangers were swapping stories like old friends. Tools passed from hand to hand. Children knelt beside sawdust piles as if they were sand castles. And somewhere beyond the hum of voices and the smell of varnish and fresh bread from the bakery next door, 3 figures stood just outside the parking lot. Brandon, Sylvia, and Henry didn't cross the threshold. They lingered on the sidewalk near the elm tree, whose roots had buckled the cement slightly. Each of them dressed with careful intention. Brandon in a tailored overcoat that still bore the stress creases from storage. Sylvia in a camel-colored wrap and dark glasses that didn't fully conceal the fatigue in her eyes, and Henry, hands shoved in his coat pockets, staring at his feet like he was waiting for the ground to give him permission. They hadn't received invitations. They hadn't expected to. Yet there they were, watching the world they were once destined to inherit, now spinning without them. Inside, Ellie laughed with a group of young apprentices. Her sleeves were rolled, her apron dusted in pine. She gestured toward a maple dresser, demonstrating the difference between oil and wax finish, with the ease of someone born into it, but also trained by fire. Sylvia leaned forward, adjusting her glasses, and whispered, "She's good," Henry muttered. "She's more than that. She's us, if we'd ever paid attention." Brandon said nothing. His eyes hadn't moved from the sign above the door, Hale Revival. The letters were carved by hand. He could see that even from here. Every serif a brushstroke of intent. They stood there as people flowed in and out. Some nodded in their direction, hesitant, sympathetic. One woman even paused halfway down the steps as if recognizing them from the articles, but she moved on without a word. And then Margaret appeared. She walked with a slight limp now. Age had found her joints, but not her clarity. In her left hand she carried a leather-bound folder pressed tight to her side. Her right hand waved slowly at a group of former students, now grown, gathered near the entrance with their children. Brandon stiffened. Sylvia's breath hitched. Margaret paused just before stepping into the sunlight. Her eyes lifted just once and locked onto the 3 familiar faces standing beneath the elm. A flicker passed across her face, not pain, not triumph, something colder, recognition. Brandon raised his hand slightly. Sylvia took a small step forward. Henry swallowed hard, but Margaret did not move toward them. She didn't call out. She didn't smile. Instead, she turned. Back straight, head high, she turned her back on the 3 people who had once been her children in more than name. She walked toward the courtyard garden behind the workshop, where elders shared benches with teenagers, where memories were whittled into keepsakes. She disappeared into that space like someone stepping into a future unburdened by apology. And in her hand the folder shifted. Inside was a letter handwritten on thick linen paper creased at the fold and tucked between an old family photo and a fresh sketch of a cradle in progress. It had been written the night before, slipped into her room by Ellie, after the girl returned from finalizing the last shipment of furniture headed for a Vermont heritage exhibit. Margaret had read it twice already that morning. Dear Grandma, you always said wood remembers everything, every mistake, every wound, every repair. Maybe that's why you kept building, so the world wouldn't forget you did something that mattered. Thank you for choosing me not just in paper or patents, but in the quiet moments, in the nights you stayed in the shop after dinner, in the way you let me fail without judgment, in the way you looked at me like I belonged. I don't know if I'll do this right, but I will do it honestly. Love, Ellie. Margaret carried that letter with her now, not as proof of legacy, but as proof of something rarer, choice. Behind her, under the elm, Brandon ran a hand through his hair, the same way he had when he was 17 and trying to lie his way out of skipping school. His voice was low. She saw us. Sylvia nodded. She always sees us. Henry spoke last. She just doesn't need to anymore. They stood there a few minutes longer until the wind picked up and the bells above the Hale Revival door jingled again, inviting a new wave of guests into a world they could no longer enter. Brandon turned first, hands clenched. Sylvia followed, her eyes rimmed with regret, her mouth pressed shut. Henry stayed until the last second, then whispered something to the wind. Maybe it was goodbye. Maybe it was just breath. Inside, Margaret stood beside Ellie and watched a young girl run her hands over a wooden jewelry box freshly varnished. This one, the girl asked. Ellie smiled. Only if you promise to fill it with stories, not secrets. Margaret looked at her granddaughter, this girl who never had to prove herself by name, only by effort, and smiled. Legacy, she thought, wasn't something written in ink or blood. It was chosen, carved, and given with eyes wide open. The last sliver of sun slipped behind the pine trees that bordered the back of the Hale property, and the sky broke into gold and ash. It was the kind of light that made shadows stretch long and warm, the kind that made you feel like the world was slowing down just for you. In the quiet hush of twilight, Margaret sat on the old cedar bench beneath the arbor, a half-sanded block of walnut resting in her lap. Her hands, worn and familiar with every contour of labor, moved gently over the grain with a rasp. Each stroke was slow, reverent. Across from her, Ellie crouched beside a low stool, turning a chisel in her fingers, watching her grandmother's movements like a student to scripture. The backyard smelled of smoke and lavender. Somewhere out of view, a mockingbird called once and fell silent. Neither of them spoke at first. There was no need. The rhythm of sanding had always been their language. The rasp, the brush of fingers across wood, the long exhale when a corner came out just right. Margaret's voice came eventually low and layered with time. You know, she said, people think the hardest part of aging is the body slowing down. Ellie looked up, brows lifted, waiting. But the hardest part, Margaret continued, is watching people forget who you used to be. She paused, eyes on the wood. Forget that you built things, that you meant something, that your hands once held weight, not just tremors. Ellie didn't reply. She simply kept carving. The Rương in the basement, Margaret said slowly. It was never about the money. Her sanding slowed. It was about the truth. About everything I buried down there when the world said I'd had enough. When your mother, your uncles, when even I believed that quiet was safer than being underestimated out loud. Ellie's carving paused. That Rương was a test, Margaret said. Not for them, for me. To see if I still had the courage to open it before it was too late. She held the wood block to the fading light, tilting it so the grain caught fire in amber. It turns out, she whispered, truth ages better than people do. Ellie set her chisel down. Her hands were steady now, confident in ways that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with inheritance. Margaret looked over. You see that old clock inside? The one in the living room? Ellie nodded. It was the first thing your grandfather and I built together. We fought over every inch. He wanted brass hands. I wanted walnut casing. We compromised with oak. It stopped ticking the night he died. I remember, Ellie said softly. You wouldn't let anyone touch it. I wasn't ready, Margaret replied. It felt like waking it up would erase him. She set the sanded block beside her. It was warm now, like it had remembered how to breathe. But then I realized something. That clock didn't stop because he left. It stopped because I did. Ellie stood and walked inside. A moment later, she returned with the clock in her arms. Its face was clean glass clear, the brass hands polished. But it was the wood that caught the eye, restored vibrant alive with age and craftsmanship. It ticked now softly like a heartbeat rediscovered. She set it gently on the work table beside Margaret. Turned out Ellie said it just needed winding. Margaret looked at her, her throat catching. They sat together as the light disappeared completely. The garden fell into dusk, and the wind shifted cool through the trees. Inside the workshop, lights flickered on warm golden, the same hue as sawdust in morning sun. In the windows, silhouettes moved new students, volunteers sweeping the floor, a father helping his son measure a board. The world kept turning. Margaret reached into her pocket and unfolded a scrap of paper, the letter Ellie had written her a year ago. She ran her fingers across the words. They were smudged from handling folded soft at the corners. She read them again silently. You always said wood remembers everything, every mistake, every wound, every repair. Margaret looked at Ellie. I don't regret choosing you, she said. But I do regret not choosing myself sooner. Ellie swallowed. You did. The moment you said no to them. You chose yourself that day. Margaret nodded. Maybe. But I could have chosen better. Earlier. She exhaled, leaned back. That's the thing about time, she said. You think it owes you, but all it ever does is pass. Ellie took the block of walnut and turned it over. Then let's carve something out of what's left. Margaret's smile came slow but sure. The two of them sat like that under the dimming sky, the tick of the clock joining the whisper of wind through the leaves. Inside the house, just visible through the open sliding door, the clock had been hung on the wall again. Above it, an engraving Ellie had made by hand, We Begin Again. Margaret's voice returned not to Ellie, but to the air like a thought finally ready to be spoken aloud. A room under the basement, she said, doesn't just hold possessions. It holds the truths we're too afraid to show until someone's brave enough to dig. She looked at Ellie again. And you, girl, you dug with your hands, not your expectations. Ellie didn't answer. She just leaned her head gently on Margaret's shoulder. And for a moment silence was enough. As the screen faded to black, the sound of the ticking clock lingered. Then a quiet piano began soft, thoughtful. Margaret's final words came not as a whisper, but as a declaration. Value isn't in the past. It's in the hands of those willing to carry it forward.